that's one of those really hard things of life, is when we look at something like that, like years later we regret the things that we did. And you see how dramatically different your life would be. Like in that case there, if he'd been around, and it isn't just his life, how different your life would be, if he'd been around. And then especially for things like that you can't go back and undo. You go to a restaurant and you order pizza, but you want a lasagna. You can always tell the waiter to take the pizza back and get the lasagna. If you're an absentee father, you can't go back and undo the last 18 years of your life. If you've been abusive, you can't go back and undo some of those things. And that's that really hard thing. I don't remember if it was in this class I was mentioning it, the thing about like when you get angry, you punch a wall. Was that in this class I was talking about there? Yeah. And you ask that thing, and so some people say that thing of, but that's not who I am. Oh, but it is who you are. It's who you are in that specific situation under those conditions. And that's why you have to not let yourself off the hook like this. Because if you let yourself off the hook and go, nah, that's just not who I am, well, then you're going to be that person. It gets even easier to approach that situation because you're not going to be looking out for it. You're not going to be aware of it. If you're not aware of the danger, then you will never see it approaching because you're not looking for it. If you're looking for the spiders, one thing I know for sure, a black widow spider will never sneak up on me because I'm looking for them. Which is funny is I woke up yesterday and I have a bite on my neck and I have a bite on my face. And I'm assuming they were spider bites, but they're not widow bites. I'm wondering if the widows sent those spiders to send a message to me that they're coming for me. So yesterday I walked out of my front door and it was dark. My laundry room is on the side of my house. I walk out and I stop and I just kind of go, I bet there's a spider, and I turn. And on the wall of my house is the biggest spider I've ever seen in my life. And I'm not exaggerating, this thing was about like this big. I have no idea what kind of a spider it was. I've never seen anything like that before. And it was right next to a web. Take a guess, what kind of spider web was it? It was a widow web. And there's this little tiny widow right there. And I'm like, I'm stuck. I want to see this big giant monster destroying that widow spider. Maybe he's on my side. Maybe he's like, don't worry, Scanlon, I got this. But I don't think so. So I Spartan kicked him and smushed both of them. And even when you kill them and they like shrivel up, this thing was still like this big, all shriveled up. I have no idea what kind of spider that thing was. But when you're looking for it, of course you're going to find it. If you're looking for negativity, you're going to find it. If you're looking for positivity, you're going to find it. The trick is to be able to look for what's actually there and not what you're looking for, if that makes sense. And that's a very hard thing to do. Because how do you know when you found it? How do you know when what you're actually looking at is what's really there versus what it is that you're expecting to find? And of course you have to have the courage to look for what's actually there. Going back to what Michael was saying, when you're staring into an abyss, well geez, well first off, what's an abyss? Nothingness. Exactly, it's like nothingness. This is like a dark void of nothing. And so when you're staring into nothing, well, nothingness stares back into you. And so we can think of it as the closet that we're talking about the other day, that you're projecting into the unknown, the things of your imagination. Or, and so what you're seeing in that empty closet is a mirror, but it's a mirror into your soul, not of your face. When you stare into an abyss and that thing stares back into you, well, now you're going to become the thing that you're staring into. And we can keep it real vague, or we can be real specific. The things that you indulge yourself into are the things that you're going to become. The things that you study are the things that you're going to become. The things that you listen to over and over again are things that you're going to become. Let's say that you and I are sitting in a bathtub together. It's only weird if you ask. Now, if I look at you and I go, guess what? And you're like, what? I just peed in here. Yeah, if you weren't running from the bathtub then, you're probably running out of the bathtub now. Now, let's say that instead of being in a bathtub, we're in a pool. Now I'm like here, and you're like where the card is, and I go, guess what? And you're like, I know that look. You peed again, didn't you? And I'm like, yeah, I peed in here. You're like, dude, you're just gross, and you just swim away, whatever. If we're in the ocean, let's say, and we have that same distance, and I tell you, I just peed, it would probably bother you a whole lot less. But everybody pees in the ocean, even the whale is peeing here, whatever. The point is that how much of an effect that has on you has to do with the size of the pool that you're in. If you're in a bathtub, it's terrible. If you're in an ocean, far less terrible. What I'm suggesting to you is that you have to be in an absolute ocean of virtue to get even just a little bit of a stream of pollution and not become corrupted yourself. If you're in a bathtub, it just takes a little bit of water to destroy all the water in the bathtub. If you're in an ocean, we can't even imagine how much pollution it would take. Even if we have like an oil spill, like, millions and millions of gallons of oil, nature cleans it up pretty quickly within a few years because the body is so big. If you're staring into an abyss and the abyss into which you're staring is something about yourself and you don't have a deep foundation of yourself, a deep virtue in yourself, it doesn't take much for you to become corrupted. In other words, if the movies that you're watching, the music that you're listening to, the company that you're keeping, the family and everything, it doesn't take a lot of negative influence to drive you into a negative direction. And this is something that we intuitively know. I wonder if any of you been that kid in a group of really bad people? But you're the one point of virtue, you're the one good kid. And one day, all the bad kids around you said, you know what? We're not living right. We need to live more like you. And all the bad kids turned good. Never happened, huh? Any of you, I wonder if any of you know somebody, not you of course, but maybe you know somebody, a friend of yours, who was hanging out with the bad kids and then all of a sudden started behaving badly. Seems to go way more in that direction than in the other direction of making everybody around us good. And that's because the things into which we stare, we become. If you're hanging out around a bunch of bad people, you're going to become bad. And even if they're not bad people, even if they're just doing bad stuff, you will start to do bad stuff. You know, why? Just because it's a social thing, man. The same is true probably about good things. If you hang out around a bunch of good people, you might try to influence them a little bit towards doing negative stuff, but eventually the ocean that you're in is going to win out. If you're with like one other person and you're good and they're bad, who knows which way it's going to go. If you hang out and you're the one bad kid and you're surrounded by like 10, like a pool of like 10 kids, maybe you'll start to do, you'll have less of an effect on them. If you're among 100 or 200 or 1,000 good people and you're the one bad person, there's a good chance that that ocean of good people is going to convert you over to being good. And now we start to think about all of the little streams of negativity that we allow into our lives. Whether it's the music we listen to, whether it's the comments that we indulge in on social media, whether it's the arguments we allow ourselves to get drawn into, or whether it's the leaning on the trauma that we've suffered. If you suffer these things and you're currently swimming in a lake or an ocean of trauma, and if someone pulls up next to you and says to you, "How's your life? How's the water?" It would make no sense to you because that's the world that you live in. It would take a whole bunch of people to come along maybe and drag you out of that water to show you what no water is, so now you know what water is. More about that in third quarter. Sometimes you have to pull somebody out of their dogmatic slumber so that they can understand what it is that they're missing. So, the monsters that you're fighting, actually they don't have to necessarily be outside of us. There are monsters in the world. I told you last time that there are snakes in the world. There are also monsters, though, that are far more nefarious and harder to defeat because they're sneaky and they're cruel. And those are the ones that are inside of your mind. Those pernicious things that dog you with, like insecurity. The things that cause us to doubt ourselves, the things that cause us to not like ourselves. Whatever those things are, they're there. Those are hard to overcome. Because again, that's the water you swim in. I wonder if any of you are that person who has a really hard time taking a compliment. There are people like this. And someone, a friend of mine, if you give her a compliment, she's so adverse to compliments that she actually assumes you must be lying to her and you probably are trying to steal something from her. And she genuinely means that. Like, you go up to her and you said to her, "I like your hair." She'll look at you and go, "Okay." And I've seen that kind of reaction from her before. She's not like incredibly rude about it. She'll be like, "Okay, yeah, well, thank you." And then when the person goes away, she'll say, "I wonder what they wanted." They're like, "Probably just excited they liked your hair." She's like, "Yeah, but why would someone do that?" I'm like, well, you see me do that sometimes. I'll tell someone, yeah, I like your shoes. She's like, yeah, but you're different. You know what's different about me, by the way? Nothing. She knows me. That's all it is. Because we have so many conversations, she can sit there after a long time and finally say, okay, I can see you just want to compliment people, but you're so rare. The only thing that's rare about me is that you know me. Everybody, I'm not saying that everybody's like this, though. There are lots of people like this. But if you're projecting it onto them, well then, yeah, you're going to see something bad in their intentions. You know? And then there are some people who, if someone doesn't compliment you and doesn't like worship you and bow down to you, you think, wow, there's something wrong with this person. How do they not recognize how great I am? Yeah.
Oh, we could be like that.
Absolutely. You guys ever hear of Aristotle?
Yes.
Yeah. I oftentimes will introduce certain people to say, he's a really famous philosopher, and I'll ask, anybody ever hear of him? There's like one person, like maybe he's not so famous. He had a very famous teacher. Anybody know his teacher's name? Plato. Plato's famous teacher? Socrates, yeah. So these three guys. Aristotle, really smart dude. He wrote so much that people have been suspicious about whether or not he wrote everything that's been attributed to him, just because he wrote so much about so many different topics. But he has this idea. It's called the doctrine of the mean. And by mean, he's talking about like an average, a midpoint, not to be cruel. And essentially, it works like this. Think about any virtue, any positive virtue that we can think of. Something like
Mercy.
Okay, so maybe mercy. I'm going to say that mercy is a positive virtue for a person to have. Okay? And so when you're trying to figure out what mercy is, he says it's a mean. It's a midpoint between two vices. One when you have too much of something, too little of something, and one when you have too much of something. So if you're somebody who has, like, let's say, too much mercy, like you're just too merciful, people walk all over you, what would we call that?
Pushover?
Yeah, pushover. So you might say if someone's merciful, then you're a pushover. And the reason that that's bad is because obviously people will take negative advantage of you, but also you're encouraging people to be bad by being too merciful. There was an AP here he's a principal now. It's been a while since he's been here. I liked him a lot. His name is Mr. Gouveia. And Gouveia was like this guy who was, he talked like this. Hi guys, how are you? You could go running up to him and just go, Gouveia, they just bombed the new gym. He'd be like, okay. Anybody dead? Everyone, they're all dead. Thousands dead. Okay, well, let's go find out what happened. He was just so laid back. I watched him. There was a brawl going on. I'm talking like a bunch of people brawling, and Gouveia walking up to hands in his pockets, just real calm. He gets up there and starts pulling people apart, and he never raises his voice the whole time. But anyway, he had this reputation where you go in there, and he called everybody Mijo and Mija, and so you go in there and go like, Mijo, you can't just go stab all your classmates. But I want to. You can't do that. Okay, so I'm going to suspend you for a day for murdering 9 people. When you come back, you need to write some letters of apology, okay? I'm exaggerating, but he had a reputation for being a pushover. Now, what about if somebody has too little mercy? What's that? Asshole. If someone has too little mercy, they're a body part. Okay? So you don't want to be an asshole, and you don't want to be a pushover either. If you want to be merciful, it's to be right there in the middle. To have just enough of it. Not too much, not too little, like the porridge. You want it to be just right. Now, what it takes to be this, that takes wisdom. Like, how do you know when you're too merciful or not merciful enough? It's wisdom. If this makes sense? Okay. So, does this make sense? I'm not saying we agree with it. So he argued that every virtue that you can name, mercy, even like kindness, we might say, courage as well, every positive virtue that you can name has a midpoint, and it's got vices on each side, extremes that you actually become a worse person if you engage in those extremes. So Aristotle's idea of how to be a good person was to find the midpoints of all of these virtues and then just pursue them. And then again, of course, how much of it you need to do is just wisdom. I was suggesting that the monsters reside on these wings, on the outsides out here. That if you're asking yourself, like, am I being too much of something? That's where the bad stuff is happening, out here. And this is the bad stuff can happen here because you allow the bad stuff to happen. Or on this side over here, you're the person causing the bad stuff. And on both sides, I might suggest that in that monster equation, that you're equally responsible for both of these two sides of things. So, how do you know if you're the monster? If you're outside of these things, especially on the extreme side, because this is what a monster kind of is. The person who loses control. You know, in the case of having too little mercy, you're becoming an asshole. You would usually identify these with monsters. Monsters aren't usually pushovers outside of Pixar films. So, when you're pursuing that thing, trying to figure out if you're being too whatever, this is how you do it. It's wisdom, finding that midpoint between the two extremes. Now, so far so good? Okay, so now, going back to what you said like half an hour ago, when I started explaining this. When you're seeking, let's say for example, how do I say it? I'll just use the generic word attention. Okay? So when you're a kid, if your parents give you too little attention, how would we describe that? What word would we use? Yeah, exactly, neglect. So if your parents give you too little attention, then you're being neglected. And then that becomes the water that you swim in. And if your parents give you too much attention, they make you like the center of the universe.
Selfish.
Yeah, selfish, yeah, spoiled. Yeah, all of these things. Yeah. Selfish, spoiled. Then that becomes the water that you swim in. This makes it very difficult for you now to ever be in a relationship with somebody. I don't just mean romantic relationship. I'm even talking about like friends. Because if this is the water that you swim in, what is your significant other supposed to do? Well, they're supposed to, give you all the attention in the world, everything you want. And when they do that, they don't get credit for it, by the way. That's just what you're supposed to do. If they give you too little, and if you're used to being neglected, and then they treat you badly, and they neglect you, they disappear for days on end and don't text you back, and write things like K, back to you, then it won't seem strange to you because you're used to being neglected. That's how you think things are supposed to go. You want to raise someone so that they're in this midpoint between the two. And I hate using the word attention, but you know what I mean when I say that. Enough attention, positive attention. And then if someone spoils you, this is all just going to be like positive. It's like, wow, this person really spoils me. And you'll appreciate it because you'll know the difference because you've been in and out of the water. And then over here, the same thing. Wow, this person is very neglectful towards me. I can't be around that person. Then you can recognize the negativity of it. And that's what allows you, if you're here and you're merciful, then you can recognize who the asshole is and who the pushover is. And you can not allow yourself to go into those extremes. In this case over here, if you know what the proper amount of attention is, and you're used to it, and you're well adjusted, same thing. Now you can start to think about all of the character types like that, all of the things that when you're raising a child, what you want your child to be. There's this great poem by William Butler Yeats called "A Prayer for My Daughter," and he's an Irish poet. And in short, like the very beginning of the poem, the guy owns a castle, and he's sorry. Start thinking about Yeats, and there's all kinds of funny stuff about the guy, which we'll look at when we look at poetry, I think in December. Anyway, he writes this poem when his daughter's born, and he's saying essentially that he's in his castle, and outside is a terrible storm. And he's saying that he's been pacing around his room for an hour because of the terrible storm that's outside. And he means it metaphorically, but he also means it literally. There was an actual storm going on when he wrote this poem, but he's also thinking about the terrible storm that is the world. And when you're looking down at this little baby, you guys ever look at a baby and just say, what a badass? No. What kind of things come to our mind when we think about babies? Yeah. Ugly. Yeah, most babies are ugly. This is true. What else do we think of when we look at a baby?
Innocent.
Innocent? Is it strong? No. Yeah, fragile, vulnerable. And now imagine right now in your head taking the thing that you love most in the world and how much you want to protect it. I don't have any children that I know of. So but you can imagine that how much you would have to love your child if you had one, and how vulnerable and how fragile it is, and how much you love this, and how innocent it is. It's not ready for the storm outside. So you want to do everything in the world to protect it, and that makes you as a parent very vulnerable. You guys ever watch those movies where there's a CIA agent or a spy, and then they capture them and they're I won't talk, and they go, well, you will, and they bring in the guy's family or something like that, and they go, we got your family, and then the guy's like, you let them go. I always think if you're going to become a CIA agent, maybe you shouldn't do that, Like if I was one and they brought my brother in, it'd be like, we're going to torture your brother, I'd be like, can I help? Do I get to watch? But he's describing the storm outside, and he has these great lines where he says what he wants for his daughter. One of them is he wants her to be beautiful, but not so beautiful that she hurts people's feelings or that she makes other women feel bad about themselves. He wants her to be attractive, but not so beautiful that men will be like, oh, I wish I could have her, and not so beautiful that women will be like, oh, I wish I was as beautiful as her. He wants her to be kind of a little bit more than plain, but not super beautiful. He wants her to be smart, but not so smart that she's arrogant and thinks herself better than everybody else. And he's describing essentially what he wants for her. And he's describing these midpoints right here, what he wants his daughter to be. And so what I'd suggest, and I'll leave it with this. We've been talking for a very long time. That if we can recognize these things and we can say, these are the things I would want for my child if I had a child. I'd want them to be these things. And maybe these are the things that would be worthwhile for us to pursue for ourselves. Because if we're these things, well then raising a child in that kind of environment would just be raising a child in the water that we swim in. And if not, then we have to do a lot of adjustments back and forth, like I was neglected and abused, and so I have to course correct, and if you course correct, a lot of times this is what happens. We go too far with something. Course correction. Trying really hard to be involved in that life, and then it overcompensates, and it makes things worse. Why? Because he lacks this wisdom of knowing when you go too far. In other words, you can't go too far in the other direction, because you're just compounding your mistakes now. You have to once in a while sit back, take the L, and say, all right, I messed all that up. How do I be better going forward? And that's the wisdom. But that's hard, because let's face it, if we had wisdom, we might not be on these edges in the first place. But maybe that's the monster that people are struggling with, a lack of wisdom. I don't know. Questions, comments, concerns, complaints, criticisms, critiques? Happy Wednesday.